Welcome to tonight's story where survival meets destiny in the unforgiving wilderness of 1880s Montana. I'm bringing you a tale of an unlikely encounter that will test everything you think you know about trust, redemption, and the bonds that form in the darkest moments. Stay with me until the very end. This story has twists that will leave you breathless. And don't forget to comment below and tell me what city you're watching from, so I can see how far this story travels across the world. The winter of 1887 came to Montana territory like a vengeful spirit, bringing with it temperatures that could freeze a man's breath before it left his lungs. In the remote valley of Crow's Peak, where the pine trees stood like silent sentinels against the endless white Jonas cane moved through his trap lines, with the methodical precision of a man who had learned that survival depended on routine. The snow crunched beneath his worn leather boots as he checked each trap, his breath forming small clouds that dissipated quickly in the bitter air. Jonas was 34 years old, though the lines etched deep around his gray eyes made him appear older. His beard, once auburn, was now streaked with premature silver, a testament to nights when sleep had been a luxury he couldn't afford, when the screams of dying men had echoed in his dreams. 3 years had passed since he'd walked away from Fort Benton, his discharge papers crumpled in his coat pocket, and his soul carrying wounds that no army surgeon could stitch closed. The Indian Wars had taken something from him, something he wasn't sure he'd ever get back. Out here in the isolation of the Montana wilderness, he'd found a kind of peace, not the peace of contentment, but the peace of numbness, the peace of a man who had chosen solitude over the messiness of human connection. His cabin sat in a small clearing, smoke rising from its stone chimney in a steady gray column that was the only sign of human habitation for 30 miles in any direction. He'd built it with his own hands, log by log, thinking at the time that it would be temporary, just a place to winter while he figured out what came next. But temporary had stretched into permanent, and now he couldn't imagine being anywhere else. The trap lines were his livelihood, wolf pelts mostly, with the occasional fox or lynx. The territorial government paid well for wolf hides, $5 each, and Jonas had become efficient at his grim work. He told himself he was performing a service protecting the scattered ranchers and their livestock from predators. But in his more honest moments, usually when the whiskey loosened his tongue in conversations with himself, he knew the truth. He hunted wolves because they were dangerous, and hunting dangerous things was the only way he knew how to feel alive anymore. This particular morning, the cold was especially brutal. The thermometer nailed to his cabin wall had read 28 below when he'd checked it at dawn. His breath came in sharp bursts, and even through his thick coat and gloves, the chill seemed to seep into his bones. But the traps needed checking. A man couldn't make a living by staying warm by the fire. He'd been walking his lines for 2 hours, finding mostly empty traps, and the occasional frozen rabbit that had wandered into the wrong place at the wrong time when he heard it. At first, he thought it might be the wind. The Montana wind could play tricks on a man, especially in winter when it howled through the pines with an almost human voice. But as he paused, standing perfectly still with his head tilted slightly to catch the sound better, he heard it again. A cry. Human. Female. Jonas felt his heart rate spike, the first strong emotion he'd experienced in months, cutting through his carefully maintained numbness like a knife through canvas. In 3 years of living in this wilderness, he'd never encountered another soul this deep in the valley. The nearest town, Billings, was a hard day's ride, even in good weather, and there were no trails that led this way, nothing to bring a person this far into the empty country except accident or desperation. The cry came again, weaker this time, but unmistakably human. It seemed to be coming from the north, where his trapline curved around a stand of thick pines before following a frozen creek bed toward the base of the mountain. Jonas broke into a run, his boots slipping slightly on the packed snow as he fought his way through the drifts. His mind raced as he pushed through the trees. What was a woman doing out here? How had she gotten so far from any settlement? And why did the cry sound so pained? As he rounded a large boulder that marked the halfway point of his northern line, Jonas saw her. She was caught in trap number 7, a massive steel contraption he'd designed specifically for the largest wolves, with jaws powerful enough to hold a 200-pound timber wolf. But it wasn't a wolf struggling in the grip of the steel teeth. It was a woman, and the sight of her hit Jonas like a physical blow. She was young, maybe 25, with long black hair that had come loose from whatever arrangement she'd worn it in and now hung in tangles around her face. Her skin was the warm brown of someone with Apache blood, and her clothing, though torn and stained with blood, showed the distinctive beadwork and leather craftsmanship of the southwestern tribes. But what struck Jonas most was her eyes, even trapped, even bleeding, even faced with what must have seemed like certain death. In this frozen wilderness, her dark eyes held no surrender. The trap had caught her just below the knee of her left leg. Blood had soaked through her leather leggings and stained the snow around her in a crimson circle that seemed to spread even as Jonas watched. She had clearly been trying to free herself. The snow around the trap was churned up from her struggles, and her hands were raw and bleeding from trying to pry the steel jaws apart. When she saw him approaching, she stopped struggling and went perfectly still. Her hand moved to something at her waist, a knife, Jonas realized, though he couldn't tell if she intended to use it on herself or on him. "Easy," Jonas said, his voice rusty from disuse. He hadn't spoken to another human being in over 2 months. "Easy now, I'm not going to hurt you." She said nothing, but her grip on the knife didn't loosen. Her breathing was shallow and quick, whether from pain, fear, or both, Jonas couldn't tell. He could see that she was going into shock. Her lips had a bluish tinge, and despite the sub-zero temperature, sweat beaded on her forehead. Jonas slowly began to remove his heavy coat. The woman watched every movement, her body tense as a coiled spring. "You're bleeding to death," he said quietly, keeping his voice as calm and non-threatening as he could manage. "And you're going to freeze. I need to get you out of that trap." Still no response, but when he held up the coat to show that he meant to cover her with it, she gave the slightest nod. Jonas had released animals from traps before, usually dead ones, but occasionally he'd found a wolf or coyote still alive and had to decide whether to end its suffering quickly or try to set it free. The traps were designed to be opened easily if you knew the mechanism, but they required 2 hands and considerable strength. With the woman watching his every move, Jonas knelt beside the trap and examined the mechanism. The steel jaws were buried deep in her leg, probably broken bone, certainly torn muscle and severed blood vessels. If he opened the trap too quickly, the sudden release of pressure might cause her to bleed out in minutes. But if he left her there much longer, she'd die anyway from blood loss, from shock, or from the cold. "This is going to hurt," he warned her, "but I need to get pressure on that wound as soon as the trap opens, or you're going to bleed to death right here." For the first time since he'd found her, she spoke. Her voice was barely above a whisper, and her accent carried the musical cadence of someone who had learned English as a second language. "Do it." Jonas positioned his hands on the trap's release mechanism and looked up at her face. She was staring directly at him, and in that moment something passed between them. Not trust exactly, but a mutual understanding that they were both gambling their lives on the next few seconds. He triggered the release. The trap snapped open with a metallic clang that echoed off the surrounding trees. The woman gasped a sharp intake of breath that spoke of pain beyond description, but she didn't cry out. Blood immediately began flowing more freely from the wound, and Jonas quickly pressed his coat against her leg, applying as much pressure as he dared. "We need to get you back to my cabin," he said, already calculating the distance and the difficulty of carrying her through the snow. "Can you put any weight on it?" She tried to shift position and immediately went pale. "No," she said through gritted teeth. Jonas nodded. He'd expected as much. The leg was almost certainly broken, and even if it wasn't, the muscle damage would make walking impossible. He was going to have to carry her. "I'm going to pick you up now," he told her. "Try to keep pressure on that wound." As he slid his arms under her, Jonas was struck by how light she seemed, too light. She was clearly malnourished, probably had been traveling for days without adequate food or water. Her body was tense against his every muscle, rigid with the effort of staying conscious. "What's your name?" Jonas asked as he began the difficult journey back through the snow. He thought conversation might help keep her alert. There was a long pause before she answered. "Lena." Jonas suspected it wasn't her real name, but he didn't press. In his experience, people chose new names when they needed to leave their old lives behind. He understood that impulse better than most. "I'm Jonas," he offered in return. The trip back to the cabin took nearly an hour. Jonas had to stop frequently to rest and to check that Lena was still conscious. By the time they reached the clearing where his cabin sat, his arms ached and his back screamed in protest. But the woman in his arms was still breathing. The interior of Jonas's cabin reflected the personality of a man who had given up on the future. It was functional but spare: a stone fireplace, a rough wooden table, 2 chairs that didn't match a narrow bed in one corner, and shelves lined with supplies. Everything had its place. Everything was clean and organized, but there were no personal touches, no photographs or mementos. Nothing that suggested the cabin was anything more than a place to sleep and eat between trap runs. Jonas laid Lena on his bed and immediately began building up the fire. The cabin was cold. He'd been gone for hours, and he never wasted wood heating an empty space. As the flames began to grow, casting dancing shadows on the log walls, he turned his attention to his unexpected guest. In the better light of the cabin, Jonas could see that Lena's condition was worse than he'd initially thought. The trap wound was severe, but it wasn't her only injury. There were cuts and bruises on her arms and face that suggested she'd been traveling rough country for several days. Her clothes were torn and dirty, and she had the hollow-eyed look of someone who hadn't eaten a real meal in far too long. "I need to look at that leg," Jonas said, pulling his medical kit from a shelf near the bed. It was a leftover from his army days, basic supplies for treating battlefield wounds. He'd never expected to use it on a woman in his own cabin. Lena watched him warily as he opened the kit and began laying out bandages and bottles of antiseptic. "You're a soldier," she observed. It wasn't a question. "Was," Jonas corrected. "Long time ago." He helped her sit up enough to examine the wound properly. The trap had done serious damage. The steel teeth had penetrated deep into the muscle of her calf, and Jonas was fairly certain he could see bone through the torn flesh. It was a miracle she hadn't bled to death already. "This needs stitching," he told her. "A lot of stitching, and I'm going to have to clean it first. It's going to hurt." Lena nodded, her jaw set in a hard line. "I know." Jonas began with the antiseptic, pouring the harsh liquid directly onto the wound. Lena's hands gripped the edges of the bed so tightly, her knuckles went white, but she didn't make a sound. As he worked, Jonas found himself studying her face in the firelight. There was something about her that seemed familiar, though he was certain they'd never met. Maybe it was the way she held herself, even injured and vulnerable, like a person who had learned early in life that the world could be a dangerous place and that survival depended on staying alert. The stitching took over an hour. Jonas worked with the careful precision he'd learned in field hospitals, closing the deepest tears first and working his way to the surface. Lena remained conscious throughout the entire process, though by the end she was trembling from pain and exhaustion. When it was finished, Jonas wrapped the wound in clean bandages and helped Lena lie back down. He covered her with every blanket he owned, then went to prepare food. His supplies were basic beans, salt pork flour for biscuits, but after days of whatever she'd been eating on the trail, he figured even his simple cooking would seem like a feast. As the beans simmered over the fire and the smell of baking biscuits began to fill the cabin, Jonas found himself stealing glances at the woman in his bed. Questions tumbled through his mind. Where had she come from? How had she ended up alone in the Montana wilderness in the middle of winter? And why did he feel like her arrival had changed something fundamental about his carefully ordered solitude? Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the cabin's windows. and reminding Jonas that the storm he'd sensed building all morning was finally moving in. He looked toward the door, then back at Lena, and realized that whatever had brought her to his trapline, whatever circumstances had led to this moment, they were both committed now. The storm would keep them here together for at least the next few days, two strangers bound together by circumstance and the simple human instinct to survive. As if sensing his thoughts, Lena opened her eyes and looked directly at him. "Why did you help me?" she asked. Jonas paused, a spoonful of beans halfway to his mouth. It was a good question, and one he wasn't sure he could answer. The safe thing, the smart thing would have been to put the trap out of its misery quickly and quietly. Apache woman alone in Montana territory caught in a trap. There were a dozen ways he could have justified leaving her there. The territorial authorities wouldn't have questioned it. Hell, some would have congratulated him some. But when he'd seen her there fighting for her life, even as the steel jaws held her fast, something had stirred in him that he'd thought was dead. Not sympathy exactly, and not attraction, at least not only attraction. It was recognition. The recognition of someone who had also learned that the world could be brutally unfair, that survival sometimes required choices that left permanent marks on a person's soul. "Don't know," he said finally, which was both true and not true. Seemed like the right thing to do. Lena studied his face for a long moment. "Your traps," she said. "They're well made, professional." Jonas nodded. "I hunt wolves, make my living at it." "Wolves," she repeated, and something in her tone made Jonas look up from his food. There was an expression on her face he couldn't quite read, not fear, but something close to it. "You got a problem with that?" he asked. "No," Lena said quietly. "No problem." But Jonas had spent enough time reading people's faces in dangerous situations to know when someone wasn't telling the whole truth. There was more to her story, just as there was more to his own. The difference was his secrets were buried in the past, where they couldn't hurt anyone. Hers, he was beginning to suspect, might be very much alive and possibly heading his way through the Montana snow. As the evening wore on, they ate in companionable silence. The storm outside grew stronger, and the cabin became a small island of warmth and light in an ocean of cold darkness. Jonas found himself relaxing slightly for the first time in months. There was something oddly comforting about having another person in the space, even a stranger whose presence raised more questions than it answered. After dinner, as Lena dozed fitfully on the bed and Jonas sat by the fire cleaning his rifle, a nightly ritual that helped him think, he reflected on how quickly his ordered life had been turned upside down. This morning, his biggest concern had been whether the unusually cold weather would drive the wolf population lower into the valley. Now he had a wounded Apache woman recovering in his bed, a storm that might last for days, keeping them trapped together, and a growing suspicion that her arrival was going to complicate his life in ways he couldn't yet imagine. The wind howled around the cabin like a living thing, and Jonas found himself wondering if he'd made the right choice. Helping her had felt automatic, instinctual, the action of a man who still remembered what it meant to be human. But now, in the flickering firelight with the storm raging outside and this mysterious woman sleeping just a few feet away, he wondered if his instincts had led him into more trouble than he was prepared to handle. Only time would tell. But as Jonas banked the fire for the night and settled into his chair, with a blanket he'd given up his bed to Lena, without question he realized that for the first time in 3 years, he wasn't dreading the sunrise. Whether that was a good thing or a warning sign, he couldn't say. But it was something. And after so many months of feeling nothing at all, something was a start. The storm continued to rage through the night, and somewhere in the darkness between sleeping and waking Jonas, Cain began to understand that his life as a solitary man was over. What would replace it, he couldn't know. But as he listened to the soft sound of Lena's breathing, and the wild voice of the wind outside, he felt the first stirrings of something he'd thought was dead forever. Hope. Dawn came slowly to the Montana wilderness, filtering through the storm clouds in shades of gray and pale gold. Jonas woke to the sound of wind still battering the cabin walls, though with less ferocity than the night before. His neck ached from sleeping in the chair, but one glance toward the bed told him his sacrifice had been worthwhile. Lena was still sleeping, her breathing steady, and even the fevered flush gone from her cheeks. He moved quietly, stoking the fire and putting coffee on to brew. The familiar routine helped settle his nerves, though he couldn't shake the strange feeling that everything had changed overnight. For 3 years, his mornings had been predictable: coffee check, the weather plan, the day's trap run. Now there was someone else to consider, someone whose presence filled the small cabin with an energy he'd forgotten existed. "You're awake early." Jonas turned to find Lena watching him, her dark eyes alert. Despite the pain he could see lingering there, she'd managed to prop herself up against the wall, though the effort clearly cost her. "Habit," he said, pouring coffee into 2 cups. "How's the leg?" "Hurts." She accepted the coffee gratefully, wrapping her hands around the warm cup. "But I'll live, thanks to you." Jonas settled into his chair, studying her face in the morning light. The swelling around her left eye had gone down some, but the bruising was more pronounced now, deep purple marks that spoke of violence recent enough to still be healing. Someone had hit her, and not gently. "You want to tell me how you ended up in my trap?" he asked. Lena was quiet for so long that Jonas thought she might not answer. When she finally spoke, her voice was carefully neutral. "I was traveling north, got turned around in the snow." "Traveling from where?" Another pause. "South." Jonas almost smiled despite himself. Getting information from her was like pulling teeth, but he recognized the defensive posture. He'd worn it himself often enough. "Must have been traveling light," he observed. "Didn't see any supplies with you, no horse." "Lost the horse 2 days ago. Supplies were with it." "What spooked it?" This time the pause stretched long enough that Jonas knew he'd hit something significant. Lena took a careful sip of coffee before answering. "Wolves." The word hung in the air between them like smoke. Jonas felt something cold settle in his stomach, though he wasn't sure why. Wolves were common in these mountains. It was why his traplines were profitable. But something in the way she said the word suggested she wasn't talking about ordinary predators. "Big pack?" he asked. "Big enough?" Lena met his eyes directly. "They've been following me for 3 days. Jonas set down his coffee cup, his mind already working through the implications. If she was right, if there really was a pack tracking her, then his cabin might not be the safe haven he'd thought it was. Wolves were cunning hunters, and while they rarely attacked humans directly, a pack desperate enough might try anything. "You sure they were following you, not just hunting the same territory?" "They killed my horse," Lena said quietly. "But they didn't eat it. They left it there and kept following me." A chill ran down Jonas's spine that had nothing to do with the cold morning air. In 15 years of hunting wolves, he'd never heard of behavior like that. Wolves were efficient predators. They didn't waste energy on prey they didn't intend to consume. "That doesn't make sense," he said. "No," Lena agreed, "it doesn't." Jonas stood and walked to the window, pushing aside the heavy curtain to look out at the storm. The snow was still falling, though not as heavily as the night before. Visibility was maybe 50 yards, enough to see the edge of the clearing, but not much beyond. If there were wolves out there, he wouldn't know until they were practically at his door. "Why would wolves track a person?" he asked, without turning around. When Lena didn't answer immediately, Jonas looked back at her. She was staring into her coffee cup as if it might contain answers to questions she didn't want to ask. "Maybe they weren't ordinary wolves," she said finally. "What's that supposed to mean?" Lena raised her eyes to meet his. "You ever hear stories about wolves that hunt with purpose? Wolves that seem to think like men?" Jonas felt the hair on the back of his neck rise. He had heard such stories, usually from trappers who'd spent too much time alone in the wilderness, or from settlers who needed something to blame for livestock that disappeared in the night. Ghost wolves, some called them. Spirit wolves. Creatures that walked the line between animal and something else entirely. Old wives' tales, he said, but his voice lacked conviction. Maybe. Lena shifted position carefully, wincing as the movement pulled at her injured leg. But I've seen things in the past few days that don't fit with old wives' tales. What kind of things? Tracks that disappeared in the middle of clear ground, sounds that came from the wrong direction, a feeling like I was being herded. She paused, then added quietly, like they wanted me to end up somewhere specific. Jonas turned back to the window, his mind racing. If Lena was right, if something had been driving her north through the mountains, then her ending up in his trap might not have been the accident he'd assumed. But that raised questions he wasn't ready to consider, questions about why anyone or anything would want to bring a wounded Apache woman to his isolated cabin. "You think they drove you to my trap line on purpose?" he asked. "I don't know, but I've been thinking about it all night and nothing else makes sense." The wind gusted against the cabin walls, and somewhere in its howl Jonas thought he heard something else, a sound that might have been wolves calling to each other across the valley. He stood very still listening, but the sound didn't come again. "Even if you're right," he said, "they can't get to us in here. This cabin's built solid, and the storm will keep them denned up, same as it's keeping us inside." "Will it?" Lena asked, "because I've been listening to that wind all night, and some of those sounds weren't wind." As if summoned by her words, a long, mournful howl echoed across the valley, distant but unmistakably real. It was answered by another, then another, until the air filled with a symphony of wild voices that made Jonas's blood run cold. He moved away from the window and began checking his weapons. The rifle he'd cleaned the night before, a shotgun mounted above the fireplace, a pistol he kept loaded on the mantelpiece. All were clean and ready, but if Lena was right about the size of the pack hunting her, even his small arsenal might not be enough. "How many?" he asked as he loaded shells into the shotgun. "At least a dozen, maybe more." Jonas cursed under his breath. A pack that large was unusual, even in the heart of winter when prey was scarce. Something had gathered them together, and if Lena's theory was correct, that something had also driven them to focus their attention on one specific target. "Why you?" he asked. "What makes you worth that kind of effort?" Lena was quiet for a long moment, her fingers tracing the rim of her coffee cup. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. "Maybe it's not me they're after." Jonas froze, a shell halfway into the shotgun's chamber. "What? Maybe they were never hunting me. Maybe they were using me to find something else." She looked up at him, and in her dark eyes he saw fear for the first time since he'd found her. "Maybe they were using me to find you." The shell clattered to the floor as Jonas stared at her. The idea was impossible, insane, but it also explained things that random chance couldn't. Why had she been traveling through this particular valley? Why had his trap, out of dozens scattered across hundreds of square miles, been the one to catch her? And why did he have the growing feeling that forces beyond his understanding had been at work long before he'd heard her cry in the wilderness? "That doesn't make any sense," he said. But even as he spoke, the words, pieces of a puzzle he hadn't realized existed, began clicking into place. "Doesn't it? You're a wolf hunter, Jonas, a good one by the look of your traps. How many wolves have you killed since you came to this valley?" Jonas didn't need to think about it. He kept careful records for the territorial bounty system. 43. 43 wolves. And you've been living alone up here for how long? 3 years. 3 years of taking their packmates. 3 years of reducing their numbers. 3 years of making yourself the most dangerous thing in their territory. Lena leaned forward slightly, ignoring the pain the movement caused. What if they finally decided to do something about it? The howls came again, closer this time, and Jonas could hear the intelligence in them, the back-and-forth communication of predators coordinating their hunt. He'd heard wolves communicate before, but this was different. This sounded like planning. "Wolves don't think like that," he said, but his voice lacked conviction. In truth, he'd always suspected that the wolves he hunted were more intelligent than most people gave them credit for. He'd seen them avoid his traps after just one pack member was caught, seen them change their hunting patterns to avoid areas where he'd been active. But organizing a campaign of revenge against a specific human that was beyond anything in his experience. "Maybe not ordinary wolves," Lena said quietly, "but I told you I don't think these are ordinary wolves." Jonas picked up the fallen shell and finished loading the shotgun, his mind working through possibilities he didn't want to consider. If Lena was right, if something supernatural, or at least extraordinary, had been tracking her specifically to lead her to his cabin, then they were dealing with a threat unlike anything he'd prepared for. "Even if you're right," he said, "what are we supposed to do about it? We're trapped here until the storm passes and you can barely walk." "I don't know," Lena admitted, "but I think we better figure it out fast because—" She was interrupted by a sound that made them both freeze, the unmistakable scrape of claws on wood coming from somewhere just outside the cabin walls. Jonas grabbed the rifle and moved to the window, pulling the curtain aside just enough to peer out. At first, he saw nothing but swirling snow. Then a shadow moved at the edge of his vision, and he caught a glimpse of something that made his breath catch in his throat. It was a wolf, but like none he'd ever seen. The creature was enormous, easily twice the size of any wolf that should have existed in these mountains. Its fur was so dark it seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it, and its eyes glowed with an intelligence that was disturbingly human-like. As Jonas watched, frozen with a mixture of fear and fascination, the creature looked directly at the window. For a moment that seemed to stretch into eternity, man and beast stared at each other through the glass. Then the wolf opened its mouth in what might have been a smile, revealing teeth like ivory daggers before melting back into the storm as silently as it had appeared. "Did you see it?" Lena asked from the bed. Jonas let the curtain fall and turned to face her, his hands shaking slightly as he gripped the rifle. "Yeah, I saw it. And you're right. That wasn't an ordinary wolf." The scratching sound came again, this time from a different wall, then another and another until it seemed like the cabin was surrounded by the sound of claws on wood. They weren't trying to get in, at least not yet. They were letting Jonas and Lena know they were there. They were announcing their presence like generals positioning their army before a siege. Jonas moved through the cabin, checking every window and testing the bar across the door. The structure was solid. He'd built it to withstand Montana winters and the occasional curious bear. But he'd never designed it to keep out something that might be more than animal. "How long until the storm passes?" Lena asked. Jonas considered the question, drawing on years of reading mountain weather. "Hard to say. Could be hours, could be days. And if they wait us out, then we'll deal with that when it happens." Jonas tried to project more confidence than he felt. "This cabin stood up to worse than a pack of wolves." "Has it stood up to a pack of wolves that think like men and hunt with purpose?" Jonas didn't answer because they both knew the truth. Nothing he'd built, nothing he'd prepared for had taken into account the possibility of facing predators that operated with human-level intelligence. His traps were designed to catch animals that thought like animals. His defenses were planned around threats that followed predictable patterns. The scratching stopped as suddenly as it had begun, leaving the cabin wrapped in silence that was somehow more ominous than the sounds had been. Jonas found himself straining to hear something, anything that might tell him what was happening outside. "They're planning," Lena said quietly. "Planning what?" "I don't know, but that's what it feels like. Like they're having a conversation out there about the best way to get to us." Jonas moved to the fireplace and began building up the fire. Light was a weapon against things that hunted in darkness, and warmth would keep them alert and functional, if this siege lasted long enough for exhaustion to become a factor. "Tell me about these wolves," he said as he worked. "Tell me everything you saw while they were following you." Lena was quiet for a moment, organizing her thoughts. The first time I saw them was 4 days ago, just south of the Yellowstone. I was camped for the night when I heard them calling to each other. At first, I thought it was just a normal pack, maybe hunting elk. But then I realized they weren't moving away from me, they were circling. How many? Hard to count in the dark. At least 10, maybe 15. But Jonas, the way they moved it was like they were following orders, like one of them was in charge and the others were following his lead. Jonas paused and hear his fire building. Pack hierarchy was normal among wolves, but what Lena was describing sounded more like military organization than animal behavior. Go on, he said. The next morning I broke camp early and tried to lose them by following the river. I figured the running water would confuse their scent trail, but they were waiting for me downstream, like they knew exactly where I was going. Could be coincidence. Wolves know animal behavior, including human behavior. That's what I told myself, but then they started hurting me. Lena shifted position, trying to get comfortable despite her injured leg. Every time I tried to go east or west, they'd appear just far enough away to make me change direction. They were driving me north up into the mountains, away from any settlements or well-traveled trails. And you're sure they were the same wolves, not just different packs in the same territory? I'm sure. There was one in particular, the one I think was leading them. Huge, with fur so black it looked like he was made of shadow. He had scars across his face, like he'd been in a lot of fights, and his eyes... Lena shuddered. His eyes looked human, Jonas, like there was a person's mind trapped inside that wolf's body. The description matched what Jonas had seen at the window, and he felt his uneasiness deepen. He'd heard stories of such creatures from other trappers' wolves that seemed to possess human intelligence, that could plan and reason beyond normal animal capability. Most dismissed such tales as the products of too much whiskey and too many nights alone in the wilderness. But sitting in his cabin listening to the unnatural silence outside, Jonas was beginning to think those stories might have more truth to them than anyone wanted to admit. This leader, he said, when did you first see him clearly? Yesterday morning. I'd spent the night in a cave trying to wait them out. When I came out at dawn, he was sitting maybe 50 yards away just watching me. He didn't move when he saw me, didn't run or show any fear. He just sat there and looked at me like he was trying to figure something out. And then he turned and walked away. But the message was clear, he wanted me to follow. And when I tried to go in a different direction, the rest of the pack appeared to block my path. Jonas finished building the fire and returned to his chair, the rifle across his knees. Outside, the wind continued to howl, but underneath it he could hear other sounds. The soft pad of feet in snow, the almost inaudible whisper of bodies moving through the forest around his cabin. They're still out there, he said. I know. Lena pulled the blankets more tightly around herself. Jonas, I need to ask you something, and I need you to tell me the truth. All right. Is there anything about you, anything in your past, that might make you a target for something like this? Jonas considered the question, sifting through memories. He'd spent 3 years trying to forget. His time in the army had been brutal, but it had been fighting against other men, not supernatural creatures. His years as a wolf hunter had been successful, but no more so than dozens of other trappers working the territory. Not that I can think of, he said finally. What about your family? Any connections to the tribes, any old debts or feuds that might follow you up here? No family left alive, and I've never had any trouble with the local tribes. Jonas paused, struck by a sudden thought. What about you? You're Apache, but you're a long way from Apache territory. Why were you traveling north in the first place? Lena was quiet for so long that Jonas thought she might not answer. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. I was running from something. What kind of something? Something that wanted me dead. The simple honesty of the statement hit Jonas like a physical blow. He'd suspected she was fleeing from trouble, but hearing her confirm it made the situation suddenly more complex and dangerous. What kind of trouble? He asked gently. The kind that follows you no matter how far you run. Lena met his eyes, and he could see the weight of old pain there. I killed a man, Jonas, a white man, and his friends have been hunting me ever since. The confession hung in the air between them like smoke from the fire. Jonas had suspected she was running from something, but he hadn't expected something so serious. In the territorial justice system, an Apache woman who killed a white man would face a rope regardless of the circumstances. Was it self-defense? He asked. Does it matter? It matters to me. Lena studied his face for a long moment, as if trying to decide whether she could trust him with the whole truth. He was trying to rape me, she said finally. Him and two of his friends. They'd been drinking, decided they wanted to have some fun with the Apache girl they found traveling alone. I had a knife. Jonas felt anger rise in Bashuna's chest, not at her, but at the men who had forced her into that situation. He'd seen enough of the frontier to know that justice for Native women was rare and that most would have considered what happened to her acceptable behavior. How many men are hunting you? 3, maybe 4, the brothers of the man I killed plus some friends. They've been tracking me for 2 weeks, and you think they're still following you? I thought they were, but now... Lena gestured toward the walls of the cabin, beyond which the supernatural pack waited. Now I'm not sure which threat is more dangerous. Jonas stood and began pacing his mind, working through the implications. If Lena was right, if both human hunters and supernatural wolves were converging on his cabin, then they were caught between 2 different kinds of deadly threat. And with the storm keeping them trapped inside, their options for escape were limited. These men, he said, how close were they when you last saw them? 2 days behind me, maybe 3, but that was before the storm. They might have taken shelter, or they might have pushed through anyway. Lena paused, then added quietly, they were very determined. Jonas nodded grimly. Men motivated by revenge had a way of pushing through obstacles that would stop more rational people. And if they were experienced trackers, a blizzard might slow them down but wouldn't stop them entirely. The scratching sound began again, this time definitely coming from the roof. Jonas grabbed the shotgun and moved to the center of the room, looking up at the heavy log beams that supported the cabin structure. The scratching was methodical, purposeful, not the random clawing of animals, but the deliberate probing of creatures looking for weaknesses. They're testing the structure, Lena observed. Looking for a way in, Jonas agreed. As if responding to their conversation, the scratching stopped. For several heartbeats, the cabin was silent except for the crackle of the fire and the whisper of wind through the trees. Then a new sound began, a low, rhythmic thumping that seemed to come from all around them. Jonas recognized the sound immediately, and his blood went cold. Something was hitting the walls of the cabin, methodically working its way around the entire structure. Not trying to break through, at least not yet, but measuring, testing, learning the cabin's dimensions and construction. They're smart, Lena said quietly. Too smart. Jonas moved to the window again, but the snow and darkness made it impossible to see anything clearly. This isn't animal behavior. This is human behavior, Lena finished. Or something that thinks like humans. The thumping stopped, and once again silence fell over the cabin like a suffocating blanket. Jonas found the quiet more unnerving than the sounds had been. At least, when he could hear them, he knew where they were and what they were doing. The silence meant they were planning something new. Jonas, Lena said softly, what if they're not just supernatural wolves? What do you mean? What if there's something else entirely, something that just looks like wolves when it suits their purpose? The question hung in the air like a challenge to everything Jonas thought he knew about the natural world. He'd spent his adult life as a practical man dealing with practical problems in practical ways. The idea that he might be facing something beyond the normal rules of reality was almost too much to accept. But as he stood in his cabin surrounded by the evidence of intelligence beyond anything he'd encountered in 15 years of hunting wolves, Jonas was forced to confront the possibility that the world contained mysteries he'd never imagined. Outside, the storm continued to rage, and somewhere in its howling voice, Jonas thought he could hear the sound of laughter. The laughter in the wind faded as quickly as it had come, leaving Jonas wondering if he'd imagined it. But the look on Lena's face told him she'd heard it too, a sound that had no business coming from any wolf pack, no matter how intelligent or supernatural they might be. "That wasn't wolves," she whispered. Jonas moved away from the window, his grip tightening on the shotgun. The fire crackled behind him, casting dancing shadows on the log walls that seemed to move with lives of their own. Everything in his rational mind rejected what his ears had told him, but 3 years of solitary living had taught him to trust his instincts above his logic. "Then what was it?" he asked, though he wasn't sure he wanted to hear the answer. Before Lena could respond, a new sound broke the silence, the unmistakable crunch of boots on snow, coming from the direction of the trail that led down the mountain. Jonas felt his stomach drop. Human voices carried through the storm, distant but growing closer. "That'll be your friends," he said grimly. Lena struggled to sit up straighter, pain etching lines around her eyes. "How many?" Jonas moved to the front window, carefully parting the curtain just enough to peer out into the swirling snow. Through the storm, he could make out the dim glow of torches moving up the trail toward his cabin. 4 lights, maybe 5, bobbing through the darkness like malevolent stars. 4 or 5 men, he reported, maybe a quarter-mile out, moving slow but steady. "They pushed through the storm," Lena said, and Jonas heard something like grudging respect in her voice. "They must want me very badly. Bad enough to risk freezing to death in a Montana blizzard." Jonas let the curtain fall and began checking his weapons again. Question is, what happens when they get here and find the cabin surrounded by whatever's been scratching at our walls? As if summoned by his words, a long howl echoed across the valley, not the hunting call they'd heard earlier, but something different, something that sounded almost like a warning. "The wolves know they're coming," Lena observed, "which means we're about to have 2 hostile forces converging on this cabin at the same time." Jonas moved to the back window, trying to get a sense of what might be waiting in the forest behind the cabin. The snow made visibility nearly impossible, but he thought he could see shapes moving between the trees, dark forms that seemed to flow like liquid shadow. "Jonas," Lena said quietly, "there's something else you need to know about these men who are hunting me." He turned to look at her, noting the new tension in her voice. "What?" "The man I killed, his name was Robert Crenshaw. His family's been in this territory for 15 years, and they have connections, money, influence, friends in the territorial government." Jonas felt a chill that had nothing to do with the storm outside. The Crenshaw name was known throughout Montana Territory. They owned one of the largest cattle operations in the region and had their fingers in everything from mining claims to railroad development. If Lena had killed one of that family, she wasn't just running from revenge-minded relatives. She was running from people with the power to make her disappear legally. "You killed a Crenshaw," he said. It wasn't a question. Robert Crenshaw, Jr., the old man's youngest son. Lena's voice was steady, but Jonas could see the fear lurking in her dark eyes. "They'll never stop hunting me, even if I make it to Canada, even if I disappear completely, they'll keep looking. And now they're here." Jonas moved back to the front window, watching the torches grow closer through the storm. "Which means this cabin just became a lot more dangerous for both of us." The implications were staggering. By helping Lena, Jonas had made himself an accessory to the killing of one of the most powerful families in the territory. Even if he could prove he'd acted out of humanitarian concern, even if he could demonstrate that he'd known nothing about her identity when he'd found her in his trap, his association with her would mark him as a target. "I should have told you earlier," Lena said. "I'm sorry. I know what helping me might cost you." Jonas looked at her injured, vulnerable, facing odds that would have broken most people, and felt something shift inside his chest. For 3 years, he'd lived without connection to anything or anyone, convincing himself that isolation was safety. But looking at this woman who'd trusted him with her life despite barely knowing him, he realized that some things were worth the risk. "Too late to worry about that now," he said. "We're in this together." The torches were close enough now that Jonas could make out individual figures moving through the snow. 4 men on horseback pushing their mounts through drifts that should have been impassable. They moved with the determination of people who'd come too far to turn back, and Jonas could see the glint of rifles in their hands. "They're armed," he reported. "Of course they are." Lena had managed to swing her legs over the side of the bed, though the effort left her pale and shaking. "Jonas, if they take me, they won't just kill me. They'll make it slow, and anyone who helped me. I said we're in this together." Jonas moved to the gun rack near the door, pulling down a second rifle. "Can you shoot? With a broken leg and a body full of pain, not well, but I can try." Jonas carried the rifle to her, along with a box of ammunition. "Just point and pull the trigger. Don't worry about accuracy. If they get close enough, you can't miss." Outside, the horses had reached the edge of the clearing. Through the window, Jonas could see the riders pulling up their torches, casting wild shadows that danced across the snow. One of them was shouting something, but the wind carried his words away. "What are they doing?" Lena asked. "Looks like they're having a conference." Jonas kept his rifle trained on the group, though he knew that firing first would only make their situation worse. "Probably trying to decide the best way to approach. They know I'm here. They wouldn't have come this far without being sure." Jonas was about to respond when one of the riders broke away from the group, walking his horse slowly toward the cabin. As the man drew closer, Jonas could make out more details. A big man with a dark beard wearing a heavy coat that suggested both wealth and preparation for harsh conditions. He stopped about 30 yards from the door and cupped his hands around his mouth. "Hello, the cabin." The voice carried clearly through the storm. "My name's Thomas Crenshaw. I'm looking for someone, and I think you might be able to help me." Jonas felt Lena stiffen beside him. "The brother," she whispered. "Pooh." "You in there?" Crenshaw called again. "I know you can hear me. All I want is the Apache woman. You give her to me peaceable, and there won't be any trouble for you." Jonas remained silent, his mind working through options. Crenshaw was offering him a way out, hand over Lena, and walk away from the situation. It was the smart play, the safe play. The kind of decision that old Jonas, the man he'd been before 3 years of solitude had changed him, might have made without hesitation. "I know you're protecting her," Crenshaw continued, "but you don't know what she's done. She murdered my brother in cold blood, cut him down like a dog while he was trying to help her." "Lying bastard," Lena muttered. Jonas glanced at her, then back at the man outside. "He's trying to make it sound like I'm harboring a criminal, giving me a reason to turn you over. And are you considering it?" The question was asked quietly, but Jonas could hear the weight behind it. This was the moment when Lena would learn what kind of man had found her in the wilderness, the kind who would sacrifice a stranger to save himself, or the kind who would stand against overwhelming odds for someone who had no claim on his loyalty except her humanity. "No," Jonas said firmly, "I'm not." Relief flickered across Lena's face, followed quickly by something that looked like gratitude, mixed with surprise. Jonas realized that her experience with white men hadn't given her much reason to expect honor or decency. Outside, Crenshaw was growing impatient. "You got 1 minute to decide," he shouted. "After that, we come in and take her, and anyone standing in our way gets treated like the accomplice they are." Jonas moved to the door, keeping his rifle ready, but pointed down. He called out through the heavy wood, "She's under my protection, Crenshaw. You want her, you'll have to go through me." The response was immediate and predictable. The sound of rifles being cocked carried clearly through the storm, and Jonas saw the other 3 riders spreading out to surround the cabin. "Your choice, friend," Crenshaw called back, "but you're making a mistake that's going to cost you your life." Jonas was about to respond when another sound cut through the night, a howl that was answered immediately by at least a dozen others. The supernatural pack that had been stalking them was making its presence known, and from the sound of it, they were very close. The effect on Crenshaw and his men was immediate. Their horses began to shy and dance, sensing predators in the darkness around them. Jonas could hear the men calling to each other, their voices tight with sudden fear. "What the hell was that?" one of them shouted. "Wolves," another answered. "Big pack sounds like." Crenshaw was trying to control his mount, which was spinning in circles and threatening to bolt back down the trail. "Just wolves," he called to his men. "Nothing we can't handle." But Jonas could hear the uncertainty in his voice. These were experienced frontiersmen who knew wolf behavior, and what they were hearing didn't fit any pattern they recognized. The howling came again closer now, and this time it was accompanied by a sound that made Jonas's blood freeze, the distinctive laughter they'd heard earlier, but amplified and multiplied, until it seemed to come from every direction at once. "That ain't wolves!" One of Crenshaw's men yelled, his voice cracking with panic. "Hold your ground," Crenshaw ordered, but Jonas could see that his authority was crumbling. Whatever control he'd had over the situation was evaporating as his men faced something beyond their understanding. Inside the cabin, Lena was struggling to stand, despite her injured leg. "They're coming," she said. "All of them." Jonas helped her to the window where they could see the chaos unfolding in the clearing. Crenshaw's men were trying to keep their terrified horses under control while scanning the tree line for threats they couldn't see. The torches they carried cast wild shadows that seemed to move independently of their flames. And then the shadows began to move. Dark shapes flowed out of the forest like liquid smoke, circling the mounted men with predatory grace. They were too large to be ordinary wolves, too coordinated to be mere animals. Jonas counted at least 15 of them, maybe more, moving in perfect synchronization as they tightened the circle around their prey. "Jesus Christ," one of Crenshaw's men whispered, his voice carrying clearly in the sudden stillness. The largest of the creatures, the one Lena had described as the leader, stepped into the circle of torchlight. In the flickering flames, Jonas could see that it was even more massive than he'd realized. It stood nearly 4 feet at the shoulder, with muscles that rippled beneath its dark fur like coiled steel. But it was the creature's eyes that truly unsettled him, intelligent, calculating, and unmistakably aware. The beast looked directly at Crenshaw, tilting its head slightly as if studying him. Then impossibly it smiled. Crenshaw's horse reared, nearly throwing its rider as it tried to flee from the predator that stood watching them with such unnatural calm. The other horses were in full panic now, spinning and bucking as their riders fought to maintain control. "Shoot it!" Crenshaw screamed. "Shoot them all!" Rifles began firing muzzle flashes, lighting up the clearing like lightning. But the creatures were already moving, flowing back into the forest with supernatural speed. The bullets that should have found their marks instead struck empty air or buried themselves harmlessly in tree trunks. "They're gone," one of the men called out. "No," Lena said quietly, her face pressed against the window. "They're not gone. They're waiting." She was right. In the aftermath of the gunfire, an ominous silence had fallen over the clearing. Crenshaw and his men sat their nervous horses' rifles ready, scanning the forest for targets that had vanished like smoke. "What are those things?" Crenshaw called toward the cabin, his earlier confidence replaced by naked fear. Jonas considered not answering, but realized that their survival might depend on cooperation rather than hostility. "Don't know," he called back, "but they've been stalking us since before you arrived." "Stalking you or stalking her?" Crenshaw gestured toward the cabin with his rifle. "Both, I think." The admission hung in the air between them, a tacit acknowledgement that they were all facing a threat beyond anything they'd prepared for. Crenshaw was clearly struggling with the implications. He'd come here to capture or kill an Apache woman, not to battle supernatural predators in a Montana blizzard. "We need to get inside," one of his men called out. "These horses won't last much longer in this cold." Crenshaw looked toward the cabin, then back at the forest where the creatures waited. Jonas could see him weighing his options: continue the pursuit and risk being picked off by whatever was hunting them, or seek shelter and deal with the woman later. "Jonas," Lena said quietly. "They're going to ask to come in." "I know. If you let them in, they'll kill me the moment they feel safe." Jonas nodded grimly. The situation had devolved into an impossible choice: keep Crenshaw's men outside and watch them be torn apart by supernatural predators, or invite them in and essentially hand Lena over to be executed. "You got any suggestions?" he asked. Before Lena could answer, the decision was made for them. The creatures attacked. They came from all sides at once, flowing out of the darkness like a black tide. But their target wasn't the cabin, it was Crenshaw and his men. The horses screamed as the pack descended, some of them throwing their riders as they tried to flee, others standing their ground to fight with hooves and teeth against predators that seemed immune to conventional weapons. Gunfire erupted again, wild shots fired in panic rather than aimed volleys. Jonas saw one of the creatures leap onto a horse's back, driving the animal to the ground with the weight of its massive body. The rider rolled away, scrambling toward the cabin on hands and knees. "Let me in!" the man screamed, pounding on the door. "For God's sake, let me in!" Jonas looked at Lena, who was watching the carnage through the window with an expression of grim fascination. "Your call," he said. "He'll try to kill me the moment he's inside. Maybe, or maybe he'll be too grateful for shelter to worry about revenge." Another scream echoed across the clearing as one of Crenshaw's men disappeared beneath a swarm of dark bodies. The man at the door was sobbing now, his fists bloody from pounding on the wooden planks. "I can't watch this," Lena said finally. "Let him in." Jonas unbarred the door and pulled it open. The man stumbled inside, snow and blood covering his clothes, his eyes wide with terror. He looked around the cabin wildly, taking in Jonas with his rifle, Lena sitting on the bed with her own weapon and the warm fire that represented safety from the nightmare outside. "Thank you," he gasped. "Thank you, I thought." His words were cut off as he suddenly focused on Lena. Recognition flared in his eyes, followed immediately by rage. "You!" He reached for the pistol at his belt, but Jonas was faster. The butt of the rifle caught him across the temple, dropping him to the floor, unconscious. "That went about as well as expected," Lena observed. Jonas dragged the unconscious man away from the door and barred it again. Outside, the battle continued, gunfire screams, the sound of horses dying. Through the window, he could see Crenshaw still mounted, firing into the darkness around him, while his remaining men tried to form some kind of defensive position. But the creatures weren't fighting like animals. They were using tactics, driving the men apart, isolating them, picking them off one by one. Jonas watched in horrified fascination as the pack leader directed the assault with gestures and movements that looked disturbingly human. "They're not trying to kill them all," Lena said suddenly. "What? Look at the pattern. They could have overwhelmed them in the first attack, but they're being selective. They're leaving Crenshaw alive." Jonas studied the battle more carefully and realized she was right. While the other men were being systematically eliminated, the creatures were avoiding direct confrontation with Thomas Crenshaw. They'd killed his horse, forced him to fight on foot, but they weren't pressing the attack against him personally. "Why?" he asked. "I don't know. But it means this isn't random. They have a plan." The gunfire was becoming more sporadic now as Crenshaw ran low on ammunition. 2 of his men were definitely dead, their bodies lying motionless in the trampled snow. The 3rd was nowhere to be seen, either fled or dragged away into the forest. Crenshaw himself stood in the center of the clearing, turning slowly in a circle as he tried to keep track of the shadows moving around him. His torch had gone out, leaving him with only the dim light from the cabin windows to see by. "Last chance, Crenshaw," he called toward the forest, his voice hoarse with fear and exhaustion. "Come for me if you want, but leave the others alone." The pack leader stepped into the clearing, and for the first time Jonas got a clear look at the creature in full light. What he saw made his knees weak. It wasn't entirely a wolf. The basic shape was lupine, but wrong in subtle ways that suggested something else entirely. The proportions were too human, the way it held its head, The intelligence in its posture, the almost contemplative way it regarded its prey. And its eyes were definitely human, trapped in a wolf's skull and looking out with an intelligence that spoke of purpose and plan. "What are you?" Crenshaw whispered, though his voice carried clearly in the sudden stillness. The creature tilted its head, and when it spoke, its voice was a horrible parody of human speech words formed by a throat that wasn't designed for language. "Justice," it said. Crenshaw stumbled backward, his rifle forgotten, as he stared at the impossible creature before him. "You can talk." "I can do more than talk, Thomas Crenshaw." The creature's voice was getting clearer, more human, as if it were remembering how to use vocal cords it hadn't used in a long time. "I can remember, I can plan, and I can make you pay for what your family has done." "What my family?" Crenshaw's voice broke. "What are you talking about? 20 years ago, your father led a campaign against my people. He called it protecting settlers. We called it genocide." The creature began walking slowly toward Crenshaw, its massive paws silent on the snow. 47 of us died that winter. Men, women, children. All so your cattle could graze on land that had been ours for 1,000 years. Jonas felt pieces clicking into place in his mind. The intelligence, the planning, the way the creatures had used Lena to find him. It wasn't about revenge against a wolf hunter, or even about protecting an Apache woman. It was about settling old debts with the Crenshaw family. "I don't know what you're talking about," Crenshaw said, but his voice lacked conviction. "Your father kept a journal, detailed records of every raid, every family destroyed. He was very proud of his work." The creature was close enough now that Crenshaw could have touched it. "He wrote about a particular night when his men found a small group of my people wintering in a hidden canyon. They killed everyone except one young warrior who managed to escape into the woods, badly wounded and dying." "That's impossible. The Apache don't change into wolves." The creature's laugh was the sound Jonas had heard in the wind. "No, we don't. But sometimes when the need for justice is strong enough, when the hunger for revenge burns hot enough, the spirits offer alternatives." Crenshaw was backing toward the cabin now, his eyes never leaving the creature that stalked him. "Even if what you're saying is true, that was 20 years ago. I was just a boy. And now you're a man who thinks he can rape and murder with impunity because of his family name." The creature's voice carried a note of disgust. "Some things never change. I never, your brother did. And you've spent the last 2 weeks hunting the woman who defended herself against him." The creature's eyes glowed in the darkness. "Tell me, Thomas Crenshaw, how is that different from what your father did to my people?" Crenshaw's back hit the cabin wall. He was trapped now, caught between the supernatural predator and the building where his enemies waited. Jonas could see the man's mind working, trying to find some argument, some escape from the judgment that had finally caught up with his family. "What do you want?" Crenshaw asked finally. "The same thing your father wanted. An end to our enemies." The creature's form seemed to shift and blur in the darkness. "But unlike your father, I believe in justice rather than slaughter." "What's that supposed to mean?" "It means you have a choice. You can stay here and face the consequences of your family's actions, or you can leave, now, and never return to this territory." Crenshaw stared at the creature in disbelief. "You're letting me go. I'm giving you the choice your father never gave my people. But understand this, if you stay, if you continue to hunt the woman in that cabin, I will hunt you. And unlike her, I won't be content with simply defending myself." Jonas watched the exchange with growing amazement. The creature, whatever it was, wasn't interested in simple revenge. It was offering Crenshaw something his own father had never received: mercy. "And if I go, if I leave the territory and never come back, then you live, and maybe someday you learn to be a better man than your father was." Crenshaw looked toward the cabin windows where Jonas and Lena watched from inside. Jonas could see the war playing out across the man's face, his desire for revenge against his brother's killer, battling with his instinct for survival. Survival won. "My men," Crenshaw said quietly. "What about my men? They made their choice when they decided to hunt an innocent woman across half the territory. They paid the price for that choice." "And the one inside?" The creature glanced toward the cabin. "He lives if he chooses wisely." Crenshaw nodded slowly, then began backing away from both the cabin and the creature. "This isn't over," he said, but his voice lacked conviction. "Yes," the creature replied, "it is." Crenshaw reached the edge of the clearing and paused, looking back one more time. Then he turned and disappeared into the storm, leaving behind the bodies of his men and the twisted remnants of his family's pursuit of justice. The pack leader watched him go, then turned its attention to the cabin. Jonas felt his heart rate spike as those human eyes focused on the windows where he stood. "Jonas Kane," the creature called. "We need to talk." Jonas felt his mouth go dry at the sound of his name spoken by the creature outside. The fact that it knew who he was suggested a level of awareness and planning that went far beyond simple supernatural revenge. Beside him, Lena shifted nervously, her rifle gripped tightly in her hands. "You know my name," Jonas called back through the door, trying to keep his voice steady. "I know many things about you, Jonas Kane. I know you served with the 3rd Cavalry. I know you were at the Battle of Crow Creek, and I know you've been killing my kind for 3 years. The words hit Jonas like physical blows. Crow Creek had been one of the darkest chapters of his military service, a massacre disguised as a battle where soldiers had slaughtered a village of peaceful Indians while they slept. He'd tried to forget that night, tried to bury the memory beneath 3 years of isolation and the numbing routine of trap lines. "That was different," Jonas said, though even as he spoke the words, he wasn't sure he believed them. "Was it you were a soldier following orders just like the men who worked for Crenshaw's father? Does that make the killing more acceptable?" Jonas found himself without an answer. The comparison was uncomfortably accurate. Both situations had involved armed men following the orders of their superiors. Both had resulted in the deaths of people who'd posed no real threat. The only difference was that Jonas had spent the years since trying to atone for his actions, while the Crenshaws had built an empire on theirs. "What do you want from me?" Jonas asked. "The same thing I wanted from Thomas Crenshaw, a choice." Lena was watching Jonas carefully, trying to read his expression in the firelight. The unconscious man on the floor stirred slightly, but remained still. Outside, the wind continued to howl, but the unnatural laughter had faded, leaving only the sound of snow against the windows. "What kind of choice? You can continue to hunt wolves, to set your traps, and take your bounties. But if you do, you'll be hunting creatures like me, beings who were once human, who chose transformation over death because they had scores to settle." The creature's voice carried a note of sadness now. "Or you can put down your weapons and find another way to live in this valley." Jonas glanced at his rifle, then at the trap he'd used to catch Lena just that morning. Everything he'd built in this place, everything that had given his life structure and purpose for 3 years, was connected to killing wolves. Without that, he wasn't sure who he was or how he would survive. "And if I choose to keep hunting, then we will hunt each other until one of us is dead. And I should warn you, I am much harder to kill than the ordinary wolves you've been trapping." The threat was delivered matter-of-factly, without anger or malice. It was simply a statement of consequence, as natural as explaining that fire burns and water freezes. Somehow that made it more terrifying than any snarl or roar could have been. "Jonas," Lena said quietly, "ask him about the others, the rest of the pack." Jonas understood immediately. If this creature was what remained of people who'd been killed years ago, then the other members of the pack might have their own stories, their own reasons for choosing supernatural revenge over peaceful death. "The others with you," Jonas called out. "Are they all like you?" "Some are, others chose this form for different reasons. Your friend there understands sometimes the world gives us choices that aren't really choices at all." Jonas looked at Lena, seeing in her dark eyes a recognition that went deeper than their brief acquaintance. She'd been forced to kill to defend herself, then forced to run to avoid the consequences of that defense. In her own way, she'd been transformed by violence just as completely as the creature outside. "Why haven't you killed me already?" Jonas asked. "You've had plenty of opportunities." "Because you showed mercy when you didn't have to." The creature's voice grew thoughtful. "You found her in your trap and chose to save her rather than leave her to die. That tells me something about who you really are beneath the wolf hunter's reputation." Jonas felt something shift inside his chest. Not quite hope, but the possibility of redemption he'd stopped believing in years ago. The creature was offering him something he'd never expected to find in the Montana wilderness: a second chance. "And if I agree to stop hunting, what then?" "Then you find another way to live. There are opportunities in this valley beyond killing predators. The land is rich, the water clean. A man with skills could build something lasting here." "What about her?" Jonas gestured toward Lena. "The Crenshaws may not come back, but there will be others looking for her. Apache woman who killed a white man, that story will travel." "That," the creature said, "is between the two of you to decide. But I think you'll find that a woman who's been hunted learns to be very good at staying hidden." The unconscious man on the floor groaned and began to stir. Jonas and Lena both turned their attention to him, watching as he slowly pushed himself up to a sitting position. Blood had dried on the side of his head where Jonas had struck him, and his eyes were unfocused with confusion. "Where am I?" the man mumbled. "Safe," Jonas said simply. "For now." The man's vision cleared and he looked around the cabin, taking in his surroundings with growing alarm. "The others, Crenshaw, where are they?" "Dead or gone," Lena said quietly. "You're the only one left." The man stared at her with a mixture of fear and hatred. "You did this. You brought those things down on us." "No," Jonas said firmly. "You brought this on yourselves when you decided to hunt an innocent woman across half the territory." "Innocent?" "She killed Robert Crenshaw in cold blood. She defended herself against rape." Jonas replied, his voice growing harder. "If you can't see the difference, then you're no better than the man she killed." The man looked like he wanted to argue further, but something in Jonas's expression stopped him. Instead, he struggled to his feet and moved toward the window, peering out at the empty clearing where the bodies of his companions lay, covered in snow. "What were those things?" he asked. "Justice," Jonas said, echoing the creature's own words. Outside, the pack leader was still waiting, its massive form barely visible against the snow. The other creatures had melted back into the forest, but Jonas could sense their presence in the darkness, patient, watchful, ready to emerge if the situation demanded it. "I need time to think," Jonas called out. "Time is something we have plenty of," the creature replied. "The storm will keep us all here for another day at least. But know this, when the weather clears, you'll need to have made your choice. I won't ask again." The finality in the creature's voice left no room for negotiation. Jonas had perhaps 24 hours to decide whether to abandon everything he'd built in this valley or face a supernatural predator that seemed immune to conventional weapons. Lena was watching him carefully. "What are you thinking?" Jonas moved away from the door and began pacing the small cabin. "I'm thinking that everything I thought I knew about this place, about myself, has changed in the last 2 days. And I'm not sure the man I was before is worth fighting to preserve." The surviving member of Crenshaw's crew, Jonas had heard the others call him Mills, was staring out the window with the blank expression of someone whose world had been fundamentally altered. "They talked," he said quietly. "Those things actually talked." "Some did," Lena confirmed. "How is that possible?" Jonas found himself answering, though he wasn't sure where the knowledge came from. "Maybe when you're wronged badly enough, when you have enough reason to hate death, becomes just another obstacle to overcome." Mills turned from the window. "You believe that? You believe those things were once human. I believe that there are more possibilities in this world than any of us want to admit. Jonas stopped pacing and faced the man directly. Question is, what are you going to do with that knowledge? Mills was quiet for a long moment, his gaze moving between Jonas and Lena. Finally, he spoke in a voice barely above a whisper. Crenshaw's gone. Yes. And the others are dead. Yes. Mills nodded slowly, as if processing information that didn't quite fit in his understanding of how the world worked. Then I guess I need to figure out how to get home. In this storm on foot. Jonas shook his head. You'll freeze to death before you make it a mile. Then what do you suggest? Jonas looked toward the door, considering. The creature outside had made it clear that its quarrel was with the Crenshaw family and their associates, but it had also shown mercy to those willing to walk away. Mills might be able to leave safely if he truly abandoned his pursuit of Lena. When the storm clears, Jonas said finally, you can take one of Crenshaw's horses and head back to town, but you need to understand something. If you ever come back here, if you ever tell anyone where to find us, those creatures will know, and they won't be as merciful the second time. Mills stared at him with something like gratitude mixed with fear. You'd let me go, even knowing I came here to kill her. You came here following orders from a man who's abandoned you, Jonas replied. That makes you a victim of circumstance, not a criminal. And if I don't go, if I decide to stay and help you? The question caught Jonas off guard. He'd expected Mills to leap at the chance to escape, not volunteer to remain in a situation that had already cost 3 men their lives. Why would you do that? Mills was quiet for a moment, his fingers absently touching the dried blood on his temple. Because I've been thinking about what that thing said, about the Crenshaw family and what they've done, and I'm starting to realize I've been working for the wrong people. Lena leaned forward slightly. What do you know about the Crenshaws? More than I wanted to, it turns out. Mills moved to the chair Jonas had been using and sat down heavily. I've worked for them for 5 years, mostly as a tracker and guide. I always told myself I was helping bring criminals to justice, but lately, you've been wondering if the people you're hunting are really criminals. Jonas finished. Exactly. Robert Crenshaw Jr. had a reputation around town. Everyone knew he had a taste for Indian women, and everyone knew he didn't much care whether they were willing or not. But his father had money and influence, so people looked the other way. Until he picked the wrong woman, Lena said quietly. Mills nodded. When word came that he'd been killed, his father flew into a rage. He put together a hunting party and sent us out with orders to bring back the woman who'd done it. Dead or alive, he said, but he made it clear which he preferred. And you went along with it. I went along with it because I needed the work, and because I told myself that killing was killing regardless of the circumstances. Mills looked at Lena directly for the first time since regaining consciousness. I'm sorry. For what we tried to do, for what my friends died trying to do. You were defending yourself, and we came after you like you were some kind of monster. The apology hung in the air like smoke from the fire. Jonas could see the surprise on Lena's face. She clearly hadn't expected contrition from one of her hunters. Apologies don't bring back the dead, she said finally. No, they don't. But maybe they're a start. Outside, the wind continued to howl, but the supernatural presence seemed to have withdrawn somewhat. Jonas couldn't sense the pack leader as clearly as before, though he was certain the creatures were still there waiting in the forest around the cabin. The storm's getting worse, Jonas observed, checking the windows. Snow was accumulating against the glass, and the temperature inside the cabin had dropped noticeably despite the fire. How long do these mountain storms usually last? Mills asked. Depends. Could be another day, could be a week. But we have enough supplies to last either way. Jonas moved to the pantry and began taking inventory. Beans, salt, pork, flour, coffee, enough to feed 3 people for several days, if they were careful. The bigger concern would be firewood, especially if the temperature continued to drop. I'll need to bring in more wood before the snow gets too deep, he said. Is that safe? Lena asked. Those things are still out there? They made their intentions clear, As long as I'm not hunting them, they have no reason to attack me. You trust them? Jonas considered the question carefully. Trust seemed like the wrong word for his relationship with creatures that had just killed 3 men in front of his cabin. But there had been something in the pack leader's voice, a sense of honor, of rules being followed, even in the pursuit of supernatural revenge. I think they mean what they say, he said finally, and I think our survival might depend on taking them at their word. Mills was watching the conversation with growing confusion. You're talking about those things like they're reasonable, like you can negotiate with them. Maybe we can, Jonas replied. The leader offered me a choice instead of just killing me. That suggests they're operating by some kind of code. Or it suggests they're playing with us before they attack. Maybe. But what's the alternative? Assume they're lying and wait here for them to break down the door. We're outnumbered, outgunned, and trapped by the storm. Our best chance is to take them at their word and hope they honor their agreement. Jonas moved to the door and called out, I'm coming out to get firewood, just firewood. The pack leader's response came immediately. You may gather what you need. We will not interfere. Jonas unbarred the door and stepped outside into the storm. The cold hit him like a physical blow, and the wind drove snow into his face with stinging force. But true to their word, the creatures remained hidden. Jonas could sense their presence in the forest around him, but they made no move to approach as he gathered an armload of split wood from the pile beside his cabin. As he worked, Jonas found himself thinking about the choice he'd been given. Giving up wolf hunting would mean abandoning not just his livelihood, but his entire identity, as he'd constructed it over the past 3 years. He'd built his life around the solitary pursuit of dangerous predators, using the work to fill the empty spaces where human connection used to exist. But looking back at the cabin where Lena waited with her rifle and Mills struggled to reconcile his worldview with the supernatural events he'd witnessed, Jonas realized that his isolation had already been broken. Whether he chose to fight the creatures or make peace with them, he was no longer the solitary hunter he'd been just 2 days ago. He carried the wood back inside and began building up the fire. The warmth felt good against his wind-chapped skin, and the familiar routine helped calm his nerves. Lena was watching him with an expression he couldn't quite read. You're really considering it, aren't you? She said, giving up the hunting. I'm considering a lot of things. Such as, Jonas paused in his work, a piece of kindling halfway to the flames, such as whether there might be room in this valley for more than one person. The words surprised him even as he spoke them. He hadn't consciously decided to ask Lena to stay, but apparently some part of his mind had been working toward that conclusion throughout the day. The idea of returning to solitude after experiencing human companionship again seemed suddenly unbearable. Lena was quiet for a long moment. You're asking me to stay. I'm asking if you'd want to. Once the storm passes, once it's safe for you to travel, you could keep running. Find some place where the Crenshaw name doesn't carry weight, start over completely. Jonas added the kindling to the fire and watched it catch. Or you could stay here and help me figure out what comes after wolf hunting. And Mills. Jonas glanced at the other man who was pretending not to listen to their conversation while studying the contents of a bookshelf near the window. That's up to him. He's welcome to stay if he wants, but I think he'd be happier back in civilization. Mills looked up from the books. You're right about that. I've had enough of the wilderness to last me several lifetimes. Then when the storm passes, you take a horse and head back to town. But remember what I said about keeping quiet. I'll remember. Mills returned to his examination of the books. You've got quite a library here for a man who lives alone. Jonas had almost forgotten about the books. Volumes on history, philosophy, and literature that he'd accumulated over the years but rarely read. They'd been intended as companions for the long winter nights, but he'd found that solitude made concentration difficult. His mind had always been too busy with the logistics of survival to focus on abstract ideas. Maybe I'll have more time for reading if I'm not spending my days checking trap lines, he said. The comment drew a smile from Lena, the first genuine smile he'd seen from her since finding her in his trap. The expression transformed her face, softening the lines of pain and wariness that had dominated her features since her arrival. "What would you do instead?" she asked. "For money, I mean." Jonas had been wondering the same thing. Wolf bounties had provided a steady income, but they weren't his only option. The valley was rich in timber and game, and his cabin was positioned well for either hunting or farming. With help with someone to share the work and the isolation, there were possibilities he'd never seriously considered. "There's good farmland down near the creek," he said. "Soil's rich drainage is excellent, could grow enough vegetables to feed ourselves and have surplus to trade in town. You know farming. Grew up on a farm in Ohio before I joined the army. Still remember most of it." Lena nodded thoughtfully. "I know farming too. My people grew corn and beans before—" She trailed off, but Jonas understood. Before the wars, before the forced relocations, before the world had changed in ways that made traditional life impossible. "We could make it work," Jonas said quietly, "if you wanted to try." The offer hung between them like a bridge across an uncertain river. Jonas realized he was holding his breath, waiting for her response. The rational part of his mind was screaming that he barely knew this woman, that basing life-changing decisions on 2 days of crisis was madness. But the deeper part of him, the part that had been numbed by 3 years of isolation, was stirring to life for the first time since he'd walked away from the army. "I don't know," Lena said finally. "I've been running for so long, I'm not sure I remember how to stay in one place." "It would be a risk," Jonas admitted, "for both of us. And if it doesn't work, if we decide we can't live together, or if more trouble comes looking for me, then we'll deal with those problems when they arise. But at least we won't face them alone." Mills cleared his throat softly. "If I may," he said, "you two have been through something that bonds people together whether they want it or not. That's worth something." Jonas looked at the man with surprise. "You sound like you're speaking from experience." "I am. I was at Shiloh during the war. Saw men who'd known each other for 2 days die for each other like brothers. Sometimes circumstances create connections that years of normal life can't match." The wisdom in the observation struck Jonas as profound. He and Lena had indeed been through something extraordinary together, not just the physical danger, but the moment of choice when he'd decided to save her despite the risks. That decision had created a bond between them that went beyond mere acquaintanceship. "The creatures outside," Lena said suddenly. "They'll be part of any decision we make. If we stay here, we'll be sharing this valley with them." "Is that necessarily a bad thing?" Jonas asked. "They've shown they can be reasonable when they're not being hunted or threatened. You want to live as neighbors with supernatural wolves." Jonas considered the question seriously. The idea was undeniably strange, but then again, nothing about his life in this valley had been conventional. And if the creatures were truly what remained of people who'd been wronged by men like the Crenshaws, then they might be more trustworthy than many of his fellow humans. "I want to live with whatever allows me to sleep peacefully at night," he said finally. "And I think I'd sleep better knowing the valley was protected by things that understand justice than by leaving it empty for the next group of men who think might makes right." The fire crackled in the silence that followed, and outside the wind continued its relentless assault on the cabin walls. But inside, something had shifted. The 3 people gathered around the warmth had begun to see possibilities beyond simple survival. "There's something else to consider," Lena said quietly. "If I stay, if we build something together here, it won't just be the 2 of us." Jonas raised an eyebrow. Meaning that there are others like me. Apache women who've been driven from their homes, who have nowhere to go and no one to help them. If word gets out that there's a safe place, we could end up with more residents than we planned for." "Exactly." Jonas found the prospect intriguing rather than daunting. A community of displaced people protected by supernatural guardians. and isolated enough to avoid interference from territorial authorities, might be exactly what this valley needed. It would certainly be more fulfilling than the solitary life he'd been living. How many others are we talking about? Hard to say. Maybe a dozen women, maybe more. Some have children. Jonas did quick calculations in his head. His cabin could house perhaps 4 people comfortably, but there was plenty of space in the valley for additional structures. With enough hands to help, they could build a small settlement that would be largely self-sufficient. "We'd need more cabins," he said. "More fields cleared for farming, better defenses, even with supernatural protection." "You're serious about this?" Lena said, and he could hear surprise in her voice. "Why not? I've spent 3 years living for nothing more meaningful than the next wolf pelt, building something that could help people, that could provide safety for those who need it, that seems like a better use of whatever time I have left." Mills was listening to the conversation with growing amazement. "You're talking about founding a town?" "Maybe," Jonas admitted. "Or maybe just creating a place where people who don't fit anywhere else can find peace. The territorial authorities won't like it. A community of Apache refugees protected by whatever those things are outside, that's the kind of situation that draws attention from the wrong people." Jonas nodded grimly. Mills was right, of course. But then again, the territorial authorities had already demonstrated their priorities by supporting the Crenshaw family's pursuit of an Apache woman who'd defended herself against rape. If those were the people whose approval he needed, then he wasn't sure it was worth having. "Let them come," he said quietly. "They'll find this valley is harder to take than they expect." The conversation was interrupted by a new sound from outside, not the howling of wind or the calls of supernatural predators, but something that made all 3 humans freeze with recognition. Horses. Multiple horses moving slowly but steadily through the storm. Jonas grabbed his rifle and moved to the window, peering out into the swirling snow. Through the limited visibility, he could make out shapes moving at the edge of the clearing, riders, at least 6 of them approaching with the careful precision of men who expected trouble. "More Crenshaws?" Lena asked, her own weapon ready. "Don't think so." Jonas studied the approaching riders more carefully. "These look like official types, uniforms maybe." Mills joined him at the window. "Territorial militia," he said after a moment. "I recognize the formation they're using." Jonas felt his heart sink. The militia meant official involvement, which meant their situation had just become exponentially more complicated. Whatever choices he and Lena had been contemplating would have to wait. Survival had once again become the immediate priority. "How did they find us so fast?" Lena asked. "They were probably already looking for you when Crenshaw started his hunt," Mills replied. "The militia gets involved when there's been a killing of a prominent citizen, which means they're here to arrest me. Or kill you," Jonas said grimly. "Depends on how much they care about due process." Outside, the riders had stopped at the edge of the clearing. Jonas could see them taking in the scene, the bodies of Crenshaw's men, the signs of violence, the isolated cabin where their quarry had taken refuge. One of them was gesturing toward the others, probably organizing their approach. 6 men, Jonas reported. All armed, all trained. This isn't going to be like dealing with Crenshaw's crew. "What about the creatures?" Lena asked. "Will they help?" Jonas considered the question. The pack had intervened against Crenshaw because of old grievances against his family, but territorial militia were just doing their jobs. It wasn't clear that the supernatural guardians would see them as enemies worth opposing. "I don't know," he admitted. "We can't count on help that might not come." Mills was checking his own weapon, a pistol he'd managed to keep despite the earlier chaos. 6 against 3 if they decide to attack directly, but if they're smart, they'll try to negotiate first. Negotiate for what? For you to surrender peacefully. They probably have orders to bring you back alive if possible. The lead rider had separated from the group and was walking his horse slowly toward the cabin. As he drew closer, Jonas could make out more details. A middle-aged man with a military bearing wearing the blue uniform of the territorial militia with lieutenant's bars on his shoulders. "Hello, the cabin," the officer called out. "This is Lieutenant Morrison of the Montana Territorial Militia. We need to speak with the occupants." Jonas made a quick decision. "I'm coming out to talk." "Jonas, no," Lena said urgently. "They could shoot you the moment you step outside. If they wanted to start shooting, they would have done it already, and someone needs to find out what they want." Jonas unbarred the door and stepped outside, his rifle held in a non-threatening position, but ready for use if necessary. The cold was brutal, but he forced himself to walk steadily toward the mounted officer. "Lieutenant Morrison," Jonas said when he was close enough to speak normally, "I'm Jonas Kane. This is my property." Morrison studied him carefully, taking in the rifle and Jonas's alert posture. "Mr. Kane, we're looking for an Apache woman who's wanted in connection with the death of Robert Crenshaw, Jr. We have reason to believe she's taken refuge here. And if she has, then I need you to turn her over to my custody. She'll be transported to Billings for trial." Jonas almost laughed at the absurdity of it. Trial an Apache woman accused of killing a white man. We both know how that would end. Morrison's expression hardened slightly. "That's not your concern, Mr. Kane. Your concern is whether you're going to cooperate with a lawful order or obstruct justice." "Whose justice?" Jonas asked. "The woman in my cabin was defending herself against rape. Robert Crenshaw, Jr. got exactly what he deserved. That's for a court to decide." "No, Lieutenant. That's for decent people to decide, and I've already made my decision." Morrison glanced back at his men, then returned his attention to Jonas. "You're making a mistake, Kane. You're harboring a fugitive, which makes you an accessory after the fact. Turn her over and you can walk away from this. And if I refuse, then we'll take her by force and you'll face the consequences of your choice." Jonas felt the familiar calm that had served him well during his military service settling over him. The moment of decision had arrived, and all the abstract discussions about choices and futures had crystallized into a simple question: would he stand by his principles or surrender to expedience? "You'll have to go through me," Jonas said quietly. Morrison nodded as if he'd expected that answer. "So be it. You've got 5 minutes to reconsider. After that, we come in shooting." Jonas turned and walked back toward the cabin, feeling the weight of 6 pairs of eyes on his back. Behind him, he could hear Morrison giving orders to his men, positioning them for an assault, checking their weapons, preparing for a fight that was now inevitable. As Jonas reached the door, he paused and looked back at the forest surrounding the clearing. Somewhere in those shadows, supernatural predators waited and watched. Whether they would intervene in this new conflict remained to be seen, but Jonas realized he was no longer counting on their help. He had made his choice, and whatever happened next would flow from that decision. For better or worse, Jonas Kane was no longer a man who stood aside while others suffered injustice. The die was cast. Jonas stepped back inside the cabin, his heart pounding with the weight of what he'd just committed to. Lena and Mills were waiting by the window, their faces tight with tension as they watched the militia spread out around the clearing. "They're not going away," Jonas said, checking his rifle one more time. "Lieutenant wants you turned over for trial in Billings." "Which means a rope," Lena said quietly. "We all know how territorial justice works for my people." Mills was studying the positioning of the soldiers through the window. "They're good, professional. Morrison's got them spread in a semicircle around the front of the cabin with 2 men moving to cover the back. Classic assault formation." "How long do we have?" Jonas asked. Morrison said 5 minutes. "That was 2 minutes ago." Jonas moved through the cabin, checking their defensive positions. The heavy log walls would stop rifle bullets, but the windows were vulnerable points that would need to be watched carefully. The door was solid oak, reinforced with iron straps, but it wouldn't hold indefinitely under sustained fire. "We can't hold them off for long," he said. "Not 6 trained soldiers with unlimited ammunition." "Then what do you suggest?" Lena asked. Before Jonas could answer, a familiar voice echoed across the clearing from the forest edge. The pack leader's words carried clearly through the storm, reaching both the cabin and the militia positions. "Lieutenant Morrison." The effect on the soldiers was immediate and dramatic. Horses shied and reared as the supernatural voice cut through the wind, and Jonas could see several of the men looking around frantically for the source of the sound. "Who's there?" Morrison called back, his voice betraying his first hint of uncertainty. "Show yourself." "I am here, Lieutenant. All around you, in fact." As if to emphasize the point, dark shapes began emerging from the trees, not just a few, but dozens of them. The pack had grown during the night, or perhaps other creatures had been drawn by the scent of violence and injustice. They formed a loose circle around the entire clearing surrounding both the cabin and the militia positions. Jonas heard one of the soldiers curse in terror. These weren't ordinary wolves. Even in the dim light and swirling snow, the creature's supernatural nature was unmistakable. They were too large, too coordinated, too purposeful in their movements to be natural predators. "What do you want?" Morrison demanded, though his voice now carried a tremor he was trying hard to suppress. "The same thing you claim to want: justice." Morrison's horse was fighting his control now, sensing the predators that surrounded them. "I don't know what you are, but this is official territorial business. You have no authority here." "Don't we?" The pack leader's voice carried a note of dark amusement. "Tell me, Lieutenant, what authority did your territorial government have to murder 47 of my people 20 years ago? What court condemned the children we buried in unmarked graves?" Jonas saw Morrison's face go pale as the creature's words sank in. Like most territorial officials, the lieutenant probably knew the history of conflicts with local tribes, including some of the more shameful episodes that had been quietly forgotten by official records. "I don't know what you're talking about," Morrison said, but his voice lacked conviction. "You know enough. You know that the woman in that cabin defended herself against rape, yet you've come to arrest her for murder. You know that the man she killed was the son of someone who built his fortune on the bones of my people, yet you call his death a crime." The creature's voice was growing harder, more dangerous. "Tell me, Lieutenant, where was territorial justice when we needed it?" The militia horses were in full panic now, spinning and rearing as their riders fought to maintain control. Jonas could see that Morrison was losing authority over his men as they faced something beyond their training and experience. "We're here to uphold the law," Morrison said, though he had to shout to be heard over the sounds of frightened horses and nervous soldiers. "Whose law? The law that says a white man can rape an Apache woman with impunity. The law that says his death at her hands is murder, while her suffering is acceptable." One of Morrison's men, a young soldier who looked barely old enough to shave, fired his rifle at the nearest creature. The bullet struck empty air as the wolf-like form melted into shadow, reappearing moments later in a completely different position. "Hold your fire," Morrison ordered, but Jonas could hear the desperation in his voice. The lieutenant was beginning to understand that his men were facing something that couldn't be fought with conventional weapons. "We cannot be killed by your bullets," the pack leader confirmed. "We have already died once at the hands of men who thought justice was whatever served their interests. We will not die again for the same cause." Mills was watching the confrontation with fascination mixed with terror. "They're not going to back down," he said quietly. "Either side. This is going to end badly." Jonas was beginning to reach the same conclusion. Morrison couldn't retreat without losing face and probably his career, but pressing the attack against Chimangan's supernatural opponents would likely result in the deaths of all his men. And caught in the middle were 3 people in a cabin who'd become the focal point of a conflict much larger than themselves. "There has to be another way," Jonas said. "What do you mean?" Lena asked. Before Jonas could answer, Morrison made his decision. "All right, whatever you are, you've made your point, but I still have a job to do. The woman comes with me, or this situation escalates to something none of us want." "You're right about that," the pack leader replied. "It will escalate to something you don't want, because if you take her, you'll have to get past all of us first." Morrison looked around at the dozens of supernatural predators surrounding his position, then back at the cabin where his quarry waited. Jonas could see the wheels turning in the lieutenant's mind as he weighed his options and found them all unsatisfactory. "There is another choice," Jonas called out, stepping to the door of the cabin. Both Morrison and the pack leader turned their attention to him. "What choice?" Morrison demanded. "Trial by combat." The words hung in the air like a challenge thrown down at a medieval court. Jonas wasn't entirely sure where the idea had come from, but as soon as he spoke it, he knew it was right. It was a solution that honored both the territorial government's need for legal process and the pack's demand for true justice. "What are you suggesting?" Morrison asked. "Single combat. One of your men against me. If your fighter wins, Lena goes with you for trial. If I win, she stays free and you withdraw your men." "That's not how territorial law works," Morrison protested. "It's how frontier justice has always worked," Jonas replied. "And it's the only way this ends without everyone dying in the snow." The pack leader's voice carried a note of approval. "The old ways. I accept those terms." Morrison looked around at his men, most of whom were still struggling to control their terrified horses. The alternative to accepting Jonas's challenge was clear: a battle against supernatural opponents that his soldiers couldn't win. "And if I refuse, then we settle this the hard way," Jonas said grimly, "and I don't think that ends well for anyone." Morrison was quiet for a long moment, weighing his options. Finally, he nodded. "I'll fight you myself." "No," said a voice from among his men. "I will." Jonas looked more closely at the soldiers and saw one of them dismounting, a big man with sergeant's stripes and the scarred hands of someone who'd seen plenty of combat. He was older than the others, probably in his 40s, with the steady demeanor of a veteran who'd faced death before. "Sergeant Hayes," Morrison said. "You don't have to—" "With respect, sir, I do. You've got a career to think about. I'm close to retirement anyway." Hayes handed his rifle to another soldier and began checking his sidearm. "Besides, I've been wanting to meet the famous Jonas Kane." Jonas felt a chill that had nothing to do with the Montana winter. "You know me. I know your reputation. 3rd Cavalry Battle of Crow Creek Medal of Honor for actions against hostile Indians." Hayes's voice carried no emotion. "I was there, Kane. Different unit, but I was there." The revelation hit Jonas like a physical blow. Hayes had been at Crow Creek, which meant he'd witnessed the massacre that had haunted Jonas's dreams for years. More than that, he'd apparently bought into the official version of events that painted the slaughter of sleeping civilians as heroic military action. "Then you know what really happened that night," Jonas said. "I know what the report said. I know you were decorated for your actions." "I was decorated for participating in the murder of innocents, just like Morrison here wants to participate in judicial murder by taking Lena back for a trial that's really an execution." Hayes's expression hardened. "You've got a strange view of Justice Kane. I've got an honest view of justice, something I learned too late to do any good at Crow Creek." The sergeant was walking toward the center of the clearing, now his boots crunching in the snow. "Well, now you get a chance to prove how much that honesty is worth." Jonas looked back at Lena and Mills, both of whom were watching the confrontation with growing alarm. "If something happens to me, nothing's going to happen to you," Lena said firmly. "You're going to win this fight and send these soldiers back where they came from. And if I don't, then we'll deal with that when it happens. But I won't let you go into this thinking you're going to lose." Mills stepped forward and offered Jonas his pistol. "Extra weapon, just in case." Jonas accepted the gun, checking the cylinder before tucking it into his belt. "Watch the windows. If this goes bad, Morrison might decide to rush the cabin anyway." He stepped outside into the storm, feeling the full weight of what he'd committed to. Single combat in frontier conditions was rarely as civilized as it sounded. It usually meant a fight to the death with whatever weapons the participants chose to use. Hayes was waiting in the center of the clearing, standing relaxed with his hands resting on his gun belt. Around the edges of the space, both supernatural predators and territorial soldiers watched in silence. "Rules," Jonas called out. "No rules," Hayes replied. "First man who can't continue loses." Jonas nodded, understanding the implications. This wouldn't be a duel with formal procedures, and seconds it would be a brawl where anything went and only one man walked away. The two veterans began circling each other, boots slipping slightly on the snow-covered ground. Jonas kept his hands near his weapons, but didn't draw. The first man to go for his gun would have a slight advantage, but it would also commit him to a particular type of fight. "You really think she's worth dying for?" Hayes asked as they moved. "An Apache woman who killed a white man?" "I think justice is worth dying for," Jonas replied. "Something I should have remembered 20 years ago." "Justice," Hayes spat in the snow. "You mean letting savages murder civilized folks without consequences?" The word savages hit Jonas like a slap. It was the same language that had been used to justify Crow Creek, the same dehumanizing terminology that made atrocities possible. "Is that what you call it when a woman defends herself against rape, murder? I call it what it is, an Indian killing a white man. Everything else is just details." Jonas felt something cold settle in his chest. Hayes wasn't just following orders or doing his job. He genuinely believed that Lena's life was worth less than Robert Crenshaw Jr.'s simply because of the color of her skin. There would be no reasoning with a man who held such views. "Then we don't have anything more to talk about," Jonas said. Hayes grinned, revealing teeth stained yellow by tobacco. "No, we don't." The sergeant went for his gun first, his hand moving with the practiced speed of someone who'd been in more than his share of gunfights. But Jonas had been expecting the move, and his own draw was smoother, more fluid. Both guns fired simultaneously, the reports echoing across the clearing like thunder. Jonas felt something burn across his left shoulder as Hayes's bullet grazed him, but his own shot had been more accurate. The sergeant stumbled backward, clutching his chest. But Hayes wasn't down. The bullet had struck something, a medal or military decoration, that had deflected it enough to prevent a killing shot. The sergeant straightened up, raised his gun, and fired again. This time, Jonas threw himself sideways, rolling in the snow as the bullet whined past his head. He came up firing, putting 2 quick shots into Hayes's torso. The sergeant dropped to one knee, but managed to get off another shot that splintered the wood of the cabin wall behind Jonas. Jonas advanced, keeping his gun trained on the wounded man. Hayes was trying to reload, his hands slick with blood, but the effort was beyond him. He looked up at Jonas with eyes that held no fear, only hatred. "You think this changes anything?" Hayes gasped. "There'll be others. More soldiers, more bounty hunters. They'll never stop coming for her." "Maybe," Jonas said quietly. "But they'll have to get past me first." Hayes laughed, blood frothing at his lips. "For how long? A year, 5 years? You can't protect her forever?" "I can try." "Why? What is she to you?" Jonas considered the question as he watched the life drain out of the sergeant's eyes. What was Lena to him? A stranger he'd found in a trap. A woman whose presence had transformed his carefully ordered solitude into something chaotic and uncertain, but also someone who'd reminded him what it felt like to care about another person's welfare, someone who'd given him a reason to stand up for principles he'd thought were dead. "She's someone worth fighting for," Jonas said finally. Hayes's eyes went blank and he toppled forward into the snow. The clearing fell silent except for the whisper of wind through the trees and the nervous shifting of horses. Lieutenant Morrison had dismounted and was walking toward the scene of the fight, his expression unreadable. When he reached Hayes's body, he knelt and checked for a pulse, then looked up at Jonas. "He's dead." "Yes." Morrison stood slowly, brushing snow from his knees. "According to the terms of the combat, the woman is free to go, and you'll withdraw your men." "I gave my word." Morrison looked around at the supernatural predators that still surrounded the clearing. Besides, I don't think we're in any position to continue this mission. Jonas felt a wave of relief wash over him, followed immediately by exhaustion. The adrenaline of combat was fading, leaving him drained and shaky. His shoulder burned where Hayes's bullet had grazed him, and he could feel blood soaking into his shirt. "What will you tell your superiors?" Jonas asked. "That we tracked the suspect to this location, but were unable to apprehend her due to hostile conditions and supernatural interference." Morrison's voice was carefully neutral. "No one will question a report about encounters with hostile spirits. This territory is full of such stories." The pack leader emerged from the tree line, approaching the two men with fluid grace. Up close in daylight, the creature was even more impressive, easily 7 feet long and 4 feet at the shoulder, with muscles that rippled beneath its dark fur. "The combat is concluded," it said, looking first at Jonas and then at Morrison. "Justice has been served." Morrison stared at the creature with a mixture of fear and fascination. "What are you?" "We are what remains when justice is denied too long," the pack leader replied. "We are the consequence of actions your people thought had no consequences. And now you leave this valley and do not return. The woman is under our protection, as is the man who chose to defend her." Morrison nodded slowly. "I understand." He turned to his men who were still struggling to control their terrified mounts. "Mount up," he called. "We're moving out." The soldiers needed no encouragement. Within minutes, they had gathered their gear and were riding hard down the trail that led away from the valley, leaving behind only the body of Sergeant Hayes and the memory of a confrontation that would haunt their dreams for years to come. Jonas watched them go, then looked at the pack leader. "Thank you." "Do not thank me yet, Jonas Kane. Your fight is over, but your challenges are just beginning." "What do you mean?" The creature gestured toward the cabin with its massive head. "You have chosen to build something new in this place. That will draw attention, good and bad. Are you prepared for what comes next?" Jonas thought about the conversation he'd had with Lena, about creating a refuge for displaced Apache women, about the possibility of building a community that operated by different rules than the territorial government. It was an ambitious dream and a dangerous one. "I don't know," he said honestly, "but I'm willing to try." "Then you will need allies. Fortunately, you have some." Jonas looked around at the pack members that still surrounded the clearing. There had to be at least 30 of them, all watching the exchange with intelligent eyes. "You're offering to help. We are offering to protect what is worth protecting. You showed mercy when you could have shown cruelty. You chose justice when you could have chosen safety. These things have value." The pack leader began to turn away, then paused. "But understand this, we cannot protect you from every threat. Some battles you will have to fight alone." "I understand." "Do you, because the easy part is over, Jonas Kane. Living with the consequences of your choices, that is where the real test begins." The creature melted back into the forest, followed by the rest of the pack. Within moments, Jonas was alone in the clearing, with only the body of Sergeant Hayes and the tracks in the snow to prove that any of it had really happened. He walked slowly back to the cabin, his shoulder throbbing and his mind reeling with the magnitude of what had just occurred. When he opened the door, he found Lena and Mills waiting for him with expressions of relief and concern. "Are you hurt?" Lena asked, noting the blood on his shirt. "Just a graze. I'll live." Mills was looking past Jonas toward the empty clearing. "They're really gone, all of them. The soldiers are gone. The pack is still here somewhere in the forest, but they're not a threat anymore." Jonas moved to the fire and sank into his chair, suddenly feeling every one of his 34 years. The events of the past few days had aged him in ways that years of solitary living never had. "So what happens now?" Mills asked. Jonas looked at Lena, who was watching him with an expression he couldn't quite read. The offer he'd made earlier for her to stay and help him build something new in this valley still hung between them, waiting for an answer. "That depends," Jonas said quietly, "on whether you still want to try building something together." Lena was quiet for a long moment, her gaze moving from Jonas to the windows that showed the empty clearing beyond. When she finally spoke, her voice was steady but soft. "I've been running for so long I'd almost forgotten what it felt like to have a choice. And now I think I'd like to try staying still for a while. See what happens when you plant roots instead of always moving." Jonas felt something warm spread through his chest, not the heat of passion or the fire of combat, but the gentler warmth of hope, realized. "It won't be easy. There will be challenges we can't imagine yet." "I know, but maybe that's what makes it worth doing." Mills cleared his throat softly. "What about me? I meant what I said earlier about wanting to help, but I understand if you'd rather I moved on." Jonas considered the question. Mills had come here as an enemy, but had proven himself to be a man capable of growth and change. That kind of flexibility would be valuable in the uncertain times ahead. "If you're serious about helping, we can use all the hands we can get. But you need to understand this isn't going to be a normal settlement. We're going to be providing refuge for people that the territorial government considers criminals." "People like her," Mills said, nodding toward Lena. "People like all of us," Jonas corrected. "I killed a territorial soldier today. That makes me as much of an outlaw as anyone." Mills grinned unexpectedly. "Good thing I've always been better at following my conscience than following orders." As the afternoon wore on and the storm finally began to break, the three unlikely companions began making plans for a future none of them could have imagined just days before. They talked about locations for additional cabins, about crops that would grow well in the mountain valley, about defensive preparations and supply lines, and a dozen other practical matters. But beneath the practical discussions, something deeper was taking shape. They were creating more than just a settlement. They were building a community based on principles of justice and mutual aid that stood in stark contrast to the territorial government's philosophy of might makes right. As evening approached and Lena helped Jonas clean and bandage his shoulder wound, she paused in her work and looked at him directly. "Are you sure about this?" "Really sure, because once we start building something here, there won't be any going back to the way things were." Jonas thought about his life before she'd arrived, the endless routine of traplines and solitude, the careful numbness that had protected him from caring about anything or anyone. It had been safe, predictable, and ultimately hollow. "I'm sure," he said quietly. "I think I've been waiting my whole life for something worth building." Lena smiled, and this time the expression reached her eyes. "Then let's build it." Outside, the storm clouds were breaking apart, revealing patches of clear sky and the first stars of evening. The valley lay peaceful and white under its blanket of snow, hiding the blood and violence that had marked this day, while promising renewal and growth in the spring to come. Jonas Kane had found his trap empty that morning and discovered something far more valuable than any wolf pelt. He'd found a purpose worthy of the man he'd always wanted to be. And as he sat by the fire with Lena tending his wounds and Mills planning their first construction project, Jonas realized that sometimes the best things in life came from the choices you made when you thought you had no choice at all. The trap had been set for wolves, but it had caught something far more precious, the beginning of a new life built on the foundation of justice, compassion, and the simple human truth that some things were worth fighting for. In the mountains of Montana Territory, where the wind sang through the pines, and supernatural guardians watched over those who sought refuge from an unjust world, Jonas Kane had finally found his way home.